Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in the East Bay Photo Collective. I'm excited to be able to reconnect with Brad because we haven't talked in a while, and we were very much at the beginning of, I think both of us were starting off in a new adventure when I first met Brad. You had a lot of technical experience, but you hadn't really been working in the fine art arena as much. Is that right?
Well, basically, I had been working for a fine art printing studio in Sebastopol for a few years before I met you. When I moved down here and worked at Looking Glass, and we had worked with artists, but they were more in the like landscape photography realm. Like they weren't, and they exhibited and showed work, but you know, not in the kind of realm that you or a lot of the Bay Area artists were working in. So it was similar, but the main thing was that most of our clients were remote, so I didn't actually have a lot of in-person experience. It was all talking on the phone and communicating by email, and not actually sitting down and looking at test prints with you and stuff like that.
Right. Well, I remember coming into Looking Glass, and Looking Glass has been my resource for photography really since I was about 11. I first showed up when it was on Telegraph Avenue, and I was visiting my sister, and I wandered in, and it has always been my home base. And so whenever I have a new question, I'm like, okay, where do I go? I'll start with Looking Glass. And I went in and found you in the back corner there. And I said, okay, well, this is what I'm going to try to do. The pictures that I have put together for our slideshow kind of take us through the chronology of how I arrived in that space of digital printing, having been previously a C printer. So I've been working as a C printer, and I had actually worked at Frog Prints for many years in San Francisco, working with a lot of fine art photographers. I did that all through grad school. And then I started my own darkroom called Duck Soup in San Francisco on Folsom Street, and ultimately moved to Berkeley and rebuilt the darkroom. And that's a Creonite processor for some of you who may not know what these things look like. I had 3 enlargers set up in here, and people would rent the space, or I would work in the space and have 3 different images going at once, and you'd be in total darkness. I started working on this project Housebound, which involved printing on 3 different enlargers and getting everything absolutely in alignment. It's a series of photographs about my personal experience of raising children and feeling quite, anxious. And, also being really limited to the kinds of things that I could work with, and being obsessive about fruit or any scenes that unfolded in front of me, and also about my parents, who were a big part of my life as they were passing away at that moment. And so I wove together this narration with diptychs and triptychs that were all printed on C prints with multiple images set up on multiple enlargers, and then put, as in this format. It was incredibly complicated, did it all in total darkness, and swore I'd never do it again. And just at this moment, digital printing was starting to become a possibility. So I said, all right, I need to do that. I thought, okay, it's time to move from C printing to archival pigment printing in a digital lab. And with that, I arrived in Looking Glass. This is not exactly that same spot, but it looks more or less like you did. Brad was really unique in the sense that when I first met Brad, I was completely like at ease, because I could actually talk to Brad about what I wanted. And Brad sort of could interpret or translate what the medium could do to really a person who wasn't familiar with it. I almost need to say a lay person. When I spoke with Brad, you were using language that was similar to what I knew in the darkroom, burning and dodging and changing color just this much and that much, and just interacting with the materials in a way that was with a language that was familiar to the darkroom.
Brad, do you remember those early conversations with Janet?
I sure do. I remember that, like, one of the ways we were able to communicate was to, like, a lot of the vocabulary, like Janet said, she could use to communicate with me. Like, she'd be like, hey, this looks like it needs to be like a quarter of a stop lighter, or a third of a stop darker over here, or it's 2 points of magenta off like this. And then like when we were on South of Market, that project, I remember her saying like, okay, you need to know like how the light in San Francisco looks in like late autumn when the fog's rolling in, to kind of like, if we can make that go into the print, and that's how I want that balance of light and dark and color to be.
So these photographs were really wonderfully big. The paper's 40 by 40. And I was really excited to be working at that scale. And it's the kind of thing I could never have done in the wet lab, at least not in the one I had. And so I was really excited about that. And I went ahead and did this project. These are just some samples of some of the photographs. I was looking for the anomalies in nature when I was doing this. And I was really thinking about the metaphoric quality of these kinds of images, where you're sort of trying to work your way through the path. The housebound projects I showed you before were overlapping with this project. And so the sense of chaos at home was spilling into the way I was seeing nature. And, you know, the idea of a riff or a split, or the complexities of being joined and also separated, became, you know, different parts of the language I was working with. Do you remember printing these big prints?
Yes, I do. It's bringing back a lot of memories here. One thing that I feel like with Janet, with your work, but also with a number of artists that I work with, is, you know, the artist will fall in love with an image kind of the first way they see it, which, if you're coming from like shooting film, is usually with like a contact print or like a machine scan of a print. And so that usually provides a starting point for us to be like, okay, so like maybe this machine print isn't perfect, but it's a place to start from and to make a departure from, and this is where I want to go towards it. And so that often kind of grounds us as a place to begin. And then, you know, a lot of it's just in like Janet would arrive with like notes about how something to do with the image and how she wanted it, which direction she wanted to go from the starting point. And then we would I would try to kind of turn that into Photoshop adjustments, and then we would work on proofing and test prints, which would give us, you know, a tangible thing to kind of compare our steps along the way. Often, or not often, but sometimes, you know, we would get to a place where we liked something, and then a week later we might be like, oh, maybe this image, now that we've lived with it for a while, needs to go into a different direction, or we approved it, but then we like found that it needed more work.
This was one of them. This one was, I remember, quite, yeah, it had a few iterations. I think there was a lot of conversation in this particular one about just how much to open up the shadow detail, and how to, on the green bushes off to the right side, and dealing with, you know, the level of contrast in the background. You know, everybody's looking at this on their screen, and everything's an interpretation at this moment. But I would say there was something about this one. It just kept moving around until finally we landed on it. I think one of the big issues when I first started doing C-print, moving from C-print to digital, was how many options you had. With C-printing, it was sort of more finite, you know. It was like you go half a magenta and a yellow, and then you go back and forth, and then that was it, you know. And you're probably gonna land on something that looks pretty good, and you could burn and dodge. But it was kind of coarse corrections by comparison to what can be done digitally. And I think when you work in digital, you have to be careful to not overdo it, to try to keep that, to keep the feeling in the print not overly managed, that you got to breathe air into it so it settles in the way that you want it, but not be too, get too lost in the weeds, I guess. That's a metaphor for a bunch of pictures of trees and weeds.
I remember the one we were just looking at with them intertwined, is I remember you saying that what was the word you used? Like, it was kind of cheerful. There was like a cheerfulness because they were like, yeah, I seem to remember this story about there being like this could have been seen as like the beginning of these trees are like the beginning of a relationship that are growing together. And it was like kind of cheery, but could also be kind of ominous. And so we were trying to strike a balance and of that in the narrative that the color balance had. And another thing that I remember, it's something that I think everyone still struggles with, is like, what color green should your greens be? Because as we know, they all change throughout the year, and like we have like the green of like spring or like midsummer where it's starting to turn brown, and everything in between, and then different grasses have different colors. So that I remember with an image like this, like we were really trying to figure out like, well, is it going to be minty? Is it going to be like afternoon green? Like, so those were some of the things that we would discuss and try to work through with an image like this.
And landscape work is some of the hardest to print, I think.
And I remember something else we were working on, Janet, was, the paper that we used was warmer than the synthetic paper. So we would have to kind of factor that in. And then, on an image like the one you just had of the snow, trying to, like that has kind of a different nuance to it than when you're trying to balance on a warmer matte paper. That's just kind of another one of the challenges in switching mediums.
I did want to just share with you a few ways in which the work was seen out in public beyond the original shot in the gallery. I had a chance to do it in a public venue, in a street gallery, and I shared the space with Lori Polster, who's a sculptor, and she put together this text about Easter Island, and I really loved that show. She did a beautiful job with that, and it was great to see it in the public, and a lot of people walk by, and I like that aspect of bringing nature into the city. And then I also put it up in my local cafe.
Oh yeah,
because I was, the cafe had opened up, and I was so excited about that huge white wall. And so I had, I think I did it in connection with Open Studio. It was up for a month or so. And that was pretty exciting.